Hello everyone, welcome and glad to see you all. We're honored today to have as our presenter and conversational leader, Marsin Alshamary, who is a scholar of Middle Eastern politics, whose primary focus is on religious institutions, civil society, and protest movements. She is currently working on a book manuscript entitled A Century of Iraqi Hawza, How Clerics Shape Protests and Politics in Modern Day Iraq, which explores the historical contemporary interactions between the Shi'a religious establishment and protest movements. Marsin is a faculty associate in the Islamic Civilization and Societies program here at BC. She is also a research affiliate with the Middle Eastern Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. I've had to lay down when I read all these things. I'm not sure where you get the energy for all this stuff. She holds a doctorate of political science from MIT. So welcome, Marsin.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who braved the cold, in my opinion, the cold to come here today. Yeah, maybe it's not cold for others who are used to New England weather, but thank you so much. I thought a lot about how I wanted to present my research today, and since it's somewhat of a general audience, it's always a pleasure to get to both condense it but also talk more about the theory and generalizability. So I'm really looking forward to everyone's questions and feedback in hopes of expanding this book beyond its usual narrow audience. As I've been working on this project on and off for, at this point, 9 years since I started, my PhD and defended the topic, and now I'm turning it into a book. I've spent a lot of years physically and emotionally invested in the Iraqi Hawza, which is really a set of seminaries, clerical offices, schools, libraries, all coalescing around these shrines in southern and central Iraq, the most famous of which is the shrine in this holy city of Najaf. And I've posted a few photos of various shrines up here that I took during my field work, but you can see where these shrines are, and the seminaries and schools that erupt around them are really where my study is based. And I am going always off my notes because as I look at the audience, I thought, why is this important? Why would you even be interested in talking about this religious institution? And I was thinking about the recent news. And you may have noticed, if you follow Middle East politics, that there was recently a drone attack on U.S. troops along the border of Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, and that it was related to an Islamic resistance group that originated in southern Iraq. And this ties to the story in a very loose way. So the reason this ties to my research loosely is that this group is part of a larger group of paramilitary groups and militias that have various ideological inclinations. So some of them aren't at the same level as the one that we saw the attack launched, that launched the attack, and others are much more much more supportive of protecting Iraq itself and not really engaging in confrontation or resistance. But nevertheless, they fall under this broad umbrella of organizations that arose after the 2014 invasion of ISIS to northern Iraq. And they were legitimized into being by a fatwa, a religious edict, by a religious scholar in Iraq who's at the head of this establishment. In 2014, he called on all able-bodied Iraqi men to join security forces to fight against ISIS. And inadvertently, this actually legitimized some militias that continue to exist even after ISIS. And today we find ourselves in a position of the Iraqi government and even members of the religious establishment trying to control something that they didn't really have the intention of creating from the start, particularly these groups that you see on the news today. But fortunately for me, I don't really focus on militias. That would be very dangerous field work. Rather, I focus on what is infinitely more enjoyable, which is the spaces of learning and their relationship to politics. And I posted this photo, also both taken by me during field work, of what it looks like inside the Hawza. Of course, the one on the right is what I would say a very fancy seminary. It's not a classic usually they're a bit more modest, but essentially they're spaces of informal learning where people really opt in to study and to dedicate their lives to Islamic sciences for years. And the degree of their dedication is really manifested by the fact that they never really get a degree out of it. Like, they can't leave this institution and go teach at a public university. To a public university, they're virtually degreeless. What's funny, though, is that most of them, if they've spent their career there, they'll have what really amounts in our world to a PhD and higher. So the reason I put up this pyramid of positions is to show you that it's quite a hierarchical institution, despite the fact that it's actually very informal as a space of learning. So I argue that it's, as a space, it's something that's not very institutionalized, it's not very bureaucratized. You can, come into it as a young person, follow a teacher for years and years, study, but you don't emerge with a degree, you don't really, not at least a formal recognized one, you don't really go through examinations and standardized ones that we think of as being associated with traditional centers of knowledge in the West and even in the Middle East and in regular universities. And you're really doing it out of a sense of passion and commitment. And to give you an idea, between the first level, which is an introductory student, to the third one, which is similar to a PhD student, it takes about 20 years to reach this level. You don't really make much money out of this either, by the way. You're expected to live a life of modesty. So there's nothing attractive about this as a lifestyle, unless your family does this as a general family profession, or you're truly that committed. There's multiple reasons we can talk about why people join this institution. But by the time you reach the very top of the religious establishment, you can see the title Mujtahid refers to someone who has accumulated enough knowledge that they're able to infer Islamic law on their own. Higher than that, when you become someone who is so knowledgeable that other practicing Shia Muslims can actually follow you in daily life, you become what they call the marja taqlid. And this is where it's really important to my research and the story that I'm trying to tell. At the highest two levels, or at the highest level, you're essentially someone who can guide people to their religious practices. You can tell them what's permissible and what isn't permissible. And most importantly, people pay their religious taxes to you, which allows you to fund your own seminaries and schools and hospitals, etc. So it's really a position of a lot of authority, a lot of power. But it doesn't come easily, and it doesn't come in a very straightforward manner. The reason I got into all of this research is because I've noticed that despite this being tremendously interesting and important, every time you read about Muslims in general and Muslims in politics, you mainly, if you're looking at institutions, you hear about Al-Azhar in Egypt, which is, a very old institution, a millennium-old institution of Islamic learning, but it's Sunni, and this is a Shia religious institution. Shia is the majority population of Iraq and of neighboring Iran. In addition to that, every time you hear about Shia Muslims, you tend to think about Ayatollah Khomeini, who, of course, is someone who's almost synonymous with revolution. And interestingly, as I'll show you later, these clerics that I'm talking about are almost synonymous with non-revolution. So I'm trying to fill in this gap of where people study Islam in general, Islam in politics, and look at this institution. It's politically important to me as a political scientist because I've noticed that over the last century, every single government in Iraq, whether occupying government or a local government, has tried to either co-opt these clerics or to control them. So if you look as far back as the British occupation of Iraq, you have this very famous set of letters from Gertrude Bell to her father. They're so famous that they're a bit of a cliche for anyone who studies this time period. But she describes the religious establishment in the country. She talks about the different groups of people. She talks, here you can see she's describing, in the part that I've highlighted, the mujtahids, and she complains about them because they're the leaders of religious opinion. They can loose and bind with a word by authority, which rests on an intimate acquaintance with accumulated knowledge entirely irrelevant to human affairs. So she thinks their religious knowledge is irrelevant to human affairs, and particularly to political affairs, but yet she's very angry because they seem to have this power to move their followers. And we're talking about the majority of people in southern Iraq. And arguably at the time you can say at least 50% of Iraqis, if not more. And so she's very concerned with them. Later on, she writes, this is actually the one that I said is a bit of a cliche, but it's Gertrude Bell is wonderful in the sense that she always gives you what you want to hear from the British in Iraq in the 1920s. So despite how odious the writing is, I think it's really helpful to have this perspective. So she talks about how she would prefer if the Sunnis, who are a numerical minority in Iraq, become the leaders of the country because they don't have these clerics. So she says, I don't doubt for a moment that the final authority must be in the hands of the Sunnis, in spite of their numerical inferiority. Otherwise, you'll have a mujtahid-run, theocratic state, which is the very devil. This could have been written 20 years later. A century later. And in a way it kind of was when you look at some of the American reports from the occupation, which I'll talk about in a bit. But essentially the idea was that the British were unhappy with the power that these clerics had. There were some attempts at co-opting them, but essentially they preferred just to exclude Shia from political power, and that ended up being the prevailing political system for years to come. If you fast forward to the time period in which I did a lot of research, which was the Ba'ath period in Iraq, an authoritarian period from 1968 to 2003, synonymous with Saddam Hussein, highly repressive and highly sectarian as well. In that time period, if you spoke to Iraqis who were present at the time, they'll tell you that the government was so preoccupied with banning religious practices of the Shia because they were very much worried that these practices, a lot of which were pilgrimages, would turn into protest movements, just because of how easily it is logistically to turn a pilgrimage into a protest. But they did it in what they called a very clever way, according to one of my interviewees. He was saying that they tried to attack things that society would accept, but they actually would also diminish the role of religion. As an example, they tried to prevent women from going to the shrine. So you can imagine a conservative society would let that slide, but in essence it's just trying to make society a little bit less religious. More importantly than that, I would say, if you look at the archives of the Ba'ath Party that are currently housed at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, you can see that they had what they call an Office of Shia Monitoring. So this government was also obsessed with these clerics and their power, and their ultimate goal, if you see this quote here, was to replace the current cleric with someone who was more pro-government. And to their mind, they likened the cleric's loyalties to, they basically call him Persian. He is ethnically Persian, but in their mind, they couldn't think of him as just being a religious leader. They had to ascribe to him an ethnic identity, and to make that the identity of the enemy. At the time, they had fought this war with neighboring Iran. And so, they say their ultimate goal is to remove him and prepare an alternative marja, or religious leader, from Arab roots. So really attempting to co-opt this institution by having someone who's more amenable to them. In the Q&A, if you want to talk about it, I'm happy to pull up some data on the ethnic composition of the religious establishment and what it means for national identity, but also what it means for racism in Iraq today, and even back in the days of Baathism. So the Ba'ath Party was obsessed with monitoring these clerics and really policing them. Even in the 1990s, when they became more accepting of religion, they called it the faith campaign. Even at the time, their acceptance of religion was really just trying to find a way to control the religious establishment themselves. And I don't agree with the Baathists about much, but I don't think they were wrong in that there was mobilization capacity in this religious institution, that protest movements did emerge from pilgrimages. So their analysis wasn't wrong, and in a way neither was Gertrude Bell's. And I said we would fast forward from Gertrude Bell to the American occupation, and it's almost eerie the similarities in rhetoric that you see across the two. So you don't have to read this entire thing, but it's from Paul Bremer's memoir of his time in Iraq, which he published in 2006. And he's complaining about the power that's wielded by the Grand Ayatollah, the head of the religious establishment, Sistani, who's still present today. He likens him to the Pope for Catholics. And he talks about how he made this decision that wasn't really welcome in Washington, And in various parts of his book and in various documents from the era of the American occupation, there's this worry about what the cleric is going to do next and how much authority he'll have on the population. You can see some news reporting from the New York Times at the time. Grand Ayatollah Sistani was actually responsible for Iraqis having their constitution as early as they did, and for being able to elect people to write their constitution and to have a referendum on it. So he actually did play a role in politics. Fortunately, though, his role in politics ended up being very much aligned to a democratic ideal, and I can also talk about that later. But I think it just goes to show that there's been constant attention throughout history to what these clerics can do and their potentially destabilizing power or their ability to impact politics. This doesn't change in Iraq once the Americans leave. Iraqi politicians constantly try to go and seek legitimation by being close to the religious establishment. They'll do this in a number of ways. Some of them will be in Islamist parties and they'll say, you know, our founder was from the religious establishment and we have all this legitimacy and credibility. And others will literally go to the city itself and try to meet with a cleric so that someone can take a photo and then they can use it. So there's a big attempt to co-opt the authority of the clerics in order to appeal to the public. And interestingly, they did this so successfully, and then the politicians performed so poorly that it reflected badly on the clerics in Iraq. And I can also talk later about how the clerical establishment tried to address this, but I'm trying to fit in essentially a book in a 20-minute presentation, so I will move on from here. Move on to essentially say that just as politicians and governments tried to co-opt clerics throughout Iraq's history, the same was happening from protesters and rebels. You can imagine they would also want a similar authority. In Iraq in 1917 and 1920, there were protest movements against the Ottomans and the British, revolution against the British. And in both those time periods, a lot of revolutionaries tried to get the clerics involved. The same would happen in 1977, 79, 91, and the same happened in October 2019, much closer to when I was doing fieldwork in Iraq and giving me an ability to actually talk to people about their views of clerics there. So in October 2019, there was the biggest protest movement in Iraq since after 2003, and hundreds of thousands of youth were protesting across the cities in the center and the south. So that correlates demographically with the Shi'a, who are the Shi'a who adhere to this religious establishment. And, you know, in these protests, something I found that was very interesting is that while they said that they wanted a secular state, they used slightly different language, they still, in all these protest squares, you could see these big screens that had all the sermons from the head of the religious establishment's representatives every Friday, and protesters would sit and watch them and wait for directions as what to do. I spoke to some of the protesters, and you can see the first one says, even though I'm secular and liberal, I still believe there's common ground between me and the religious establishment. And another one saying that it was necessary that we followed the speeches of the religious establishment because it was the engine of movement for many people. Each speech which supported the revolution was a source of strength for us. The sermons are important to us so that we can gain an audience. And these sermons were essential in getting the prime minister to step down and getting a new electoral law to be written and having early elections, so they were influential. But if you actually analyze these sermons and prior behavior in various protest movements, you actually realize that they're not really meant to be supportive of the protest movements or revolutionary, but the ultimate aim for a lot of elite clerics in Iraq is essentially to protect the religious establishment from various forms of harm. And by that I mean protect it against state reprisals, protect it against violence and instability that comes from a revolution or from a civil war. So they tend to be actually very conservative in how they respond to protest. Now, I developed, because of them and through the analysis of these clerics, what I call a theory of institutional responsibility. And the main argument is that if a cleric has a high degree of responsibility and a feeling of needing to protect the religious establishment, they'll behave in a way that protects it by not really instigating protest and rarely actually getting involved in it. And this is the case, and I use these paired case studies across time to show whether there's a colonizer that's Muslim or a non-Muslim colonizer that people are protesting against. This is the case whether or not there's a permissive external environment like the Iranian Revolution. I have cases from 1977 and 1979 to show what happened before the Iranian Revolution and how clerics behaved wasn't actually that different to when they saw a revolution succeed next door in 1979. This is the case whether an individual cleric, if you look at their actual ideology and their writing, seems to be more politically involved than others or not. So it's pretty constant, and I can talk more about the cases I discuss in the book. But I find it important to lay out the ultimate finding of the book, which is that political science tends to look at religious leaders as either behaving like politicians, so very strategically, or they are ideologically motivated. But in fact, you can think of them as being strategically motivated in a way that's not necessarily in their self-interest or preservationist of themselves, but rather of an institution that socialized them and that they belong to. And I don't have a final say on this, but I would venture to say that a lot of institutions produce these kinds of individuals. And critically here, the way that an institution itself is set up, the way that a religious system itself is structured really impacts how clerics behave in it and how much of a sense of responsibility they feel towards protecting it. So some institutions seem like they can withstand the deaths of, various clerics or individuals who run it, and others can't. And I think the idea that this institution is still not very bureaucratized, it's not very institutionalized, it exists, there's a hierarchy, but it's still very tenuous, means that every elite cleric in it has a high sense of responsibility for it and really seeks to protect it. And this is the shortest version of my theory I have ever presented in my life, so thank you. If it's confusing, I am happy to go into it or any other side note that you're interested in. But thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Let me be the first one to ask a question then. Marsin, what does American journalism get wrong? What's the thing that drives you crazy when you read the New York Times?
I stopped reading the New York Times.
But what do you think American journalists miss when they report the Iraqi Hawza?
So this has changed over the years, largely because I've spoken to a lot of journalists now and have addressed the issue directly. But I think at first there was two big misconceptions. One of them was that Iranian clerics represented this ideologically rebellious class of clerics, and then the Iraqi ones were so-called quietists and didn't get involved in politics. And I think that's very much you can't use dichotomous figures to talk about clerical ideology, both in Iran and in Iraq, and that there's actually a spectrum of ideological beliefs about protest in both countries. So I used to frequently read about how Iranian clerics were trying to control the Iraqi Hawza. In reality, that's ridiculous because the Iraqi Hawza is composed at least 50% of Iranians, and yet it has a distinct identity as being different from the one in Iran. So separating the clerics from the national politics is really essential, and I think a lot of journalism gets that wrong. If you're talking specifically about religion, I can talk about a million other things that they get wrong in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. Questions? Marsin? Kristen, you did a book sort of parallel to this.
Well, I guess my question would be from the media studies perspective, which is, how do they convey their teachings and their authority to the public? I mean, obviously they convey stuff to the students that go to the schools, but do they use media in any way? Do they have their speeches recorded or public or? Yeah.
This is a really great question, and I think you'll really be interested in the answer because there was a huge shift in clerical authority that was brought about by the internet. Yeah. So previously, you see this pyramid. You can have multiple people at the head of essentially what is smaller pyramids because there wasn't much communication technology. So there were these centers of power that were in different parts of the Middle East, but recently, with the advent of the internet, a cleric who's based in one country can now, speak to a broader array of adherents and have a broader circle of followers. So, they've been using the internet to answer questions. You could actually email them. in general, sermons are used during moments of crises. There hasn't been a sermon since COVID, by the way. Because of COVID, they stopped having these sermons where people were attending. But I think they're using that as an excuse now to not to have sermons anymore, and have to comment on the political situation from time to time. And the general public isn't interested in their actual research or whatever they're doing. They're just interested in if they have an opinion on something social or political happening at the time. They have officially representatives who communicate to different communities, but I think it's pretty standard, has changed with everyone else with the internet.
Well, first of all, many thanks for your best informed and very thoughtful presentation. Since you are drawing some comparisons between Shi'ism in Iraq and Shi'ism in Iran, there is a fundamental difference between the two, which I'm sure you're well aware of, but may be relevant for some of the colleagues here. And that is that the Iranian interpretation of Shi'ism after the revolution took on a very different direction, which was the rule of the jurist, as the top clerical representative or the supreme jurist, so to speak, was essentially granted full power to control every aspect of the state politics, of foreign relations, of the military, of the press and everything else. So that kind of theocratic interpretation of Shi'ism, which came about by Khomeini, was a remarkable change in Shi'i theology. And of course, the country has been guided by that and the consequences of that, which now is being opposed by the vast majority of the Iranian people. Interestingly, the Iraqi Shiite leaders never supported that particular interpretation. Obviously, they looked at Iran as, their brethren and so on, but never supported that supreme jurist as the top authority, the theocratic interpretation. And that has essentially created a good deal of distance between the Iraqi top Shiites, including Ayatollah Sistani, who has refrained from making direct statements of support for the Iranian interpretation of Shiism. And it seems to me that that separation between that interpretation, which is much more, in the Iranian case, it's much more than religion in politics. That is the complete takeover of the entire state apparatus by the Shiite cleric. That has not happened in Iraq, and it seems to me that distinction is relevant. I'm sure you're well aware of it, but I thought it might be interesting for
you want to respond to any of this?
I don't want to monopolize too much. I can talk for 2 minutes and then go on. I mean, thank you, Dr. Ali. Of course, that's essentially right. Khomeini is foundational. I will say that I found that the actual clerics in Iraq do have a lot of experience studying and traveling to Iran, and there is a sense of cross-pollination between the two institutions that existed before and after Khomeini. They're very cagey about their political views. Because they operate in a country that's very ethno-religiously diverse, they're very aware of that, and so even if they do believe in Khomeini's concept, they believe it as not applying to the Iraqi case because of the diversity. So there's actually it's their least favorite question to be asked what they think of Khomeini. I will say, though, he did spend 13 years in Iraq in the Hawza in Najaf, and one of the people I interviewed told me that the entire time he was quite isolated and I think I told you this. They said Najaf could not digest him. They didn't know what to do with him. So I think that means more that he really is an exceptional figure, but not only in Iraq, he's exceptional even among Iranian clergy, who most of them actually didn't espouse this view, and many of them were actually opposed to him in that foundational period in 1979 when they were trying to figure out exactly what would happen in Iran, whether it would go down a theocratic route or whether it would go down more of a nationalist one.
A republic.
A republic, yes, yeah. And a lot of clerics were not happy with Khomeini's idea and didn't believe it was accurate. But I think since then, there hasn't been as much freedom of speech in Iran to be able to express that dissatisfaction with that system. But, there's closeted people on both sides thinking different things, I'll tell you that.
Any questions?
I was wondering how the public opinion think of the clergy's authority. I mean, how are they legitimized? I mean, in the public opinion, particularly the younger generations. Have you ever seen any change in the opinions of younger generations about the authority of the clergy? I'm actually comparing with the position of the clergy in Iran, which is significantly delegitimized in the public view.
Really great question, and I'm itching to pull up the graph to show you the actual, I'll send it to you later. So if you look at public opinion polling from Iraq from basically 2013 and onwards, because of this almost alliance between the clerics and the politicians, many youth have a very bad view of religious leaders for quite a long time. So there's this big dip in clerical, I would say not necessarily legitimacy, but just in public opinion in favor of them. So a lot of people have a lot of criticism about them. And this continues onwards. And reaches a bit of a plateau by 2017 or 2018, and it has plateaued ever since. But I do remember, funny enough, when I was in Iraq in 2003, in the earliest days, and I was quite young at the time, but I remember this because it was so interesting that the Iranian pilgrims who were coming to Iraq, the first waves of them were telling Iraqis to be careful to not let the clerics rule them. So it almost this like learning that transcends these borders that came through with the Iranians, and I think maybe it did, maybe it didn't, like plant the first seed of doubt, but Iraq quickly followed Iran in this kind of in this criticism of clerics. But I will say the difference between the Iraqi clerics and the Iranian ones is that the Iraqi clerics are very much aware of this happening and have worked on it. So one of the ways that they have worked on it is in this protest movement being very much mediators between the state and the protesters. And emerging from it in general with this protest movement, emerging from it in general with a positive view of the way they reacted to it. So if you talk to professedly secular and liberal activists, they'll still say that they found that the reaction of the clerical establishment was positive and perhaps surprisingly positive to them. But we can talk about this more. I've actually written a whole article about this, about clerical authority, so we can do more of this one-on-one. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much. I was wondering if I could take you up on the ethnic composition of that institution, and yeah.
Is it okay if I take this slide off for a sec? Okay. Just don't want to show you the dysfunction that is my laptop, but I will pull this up. So what I did to get this data was basically collect and bring all the way back to the US a bunch of biographical dictionaries that has the biographies of like every cleric in Iraq from like late 1800s and onwards, and I just went through their biographies and mapped out their age, what they studied, who they studied with, where they were born, where they died, and I tried to ascribe a nationality in some way to them, even though at the time there really wasn't the official nation. And then this goes on, from 1910 to the present. I would say up until the 60s, the Iranians were probably the majority, or the Persian ethnically. And then this changed because of two things. In the 60s, one of the head of the religious establishment was Arab and was very intentful of Arabizing or bringing more Arab students. And then, of course, with Saddam Hussein, he had launched a war against Iran, and he was, for lack of a better word, racist against Iranians and wanted to deport any Iraqi who had any Iranian background. So there was a wave of deportations that changed them. It not only changed the ethnic structure of the religious establishment, but it also diminished it from being in the thousands in terms of students to in the hundreds. So I think someone even cited something as low as 500 students had left where it had thousands before. But this kind of gives you an idea. It's becoming more international these days. There's international seminaries, so you can see students from the Levant, Southeast Asia. When I went and did fieldwork, my latest wave there, I noticed a lot of students actually coming from places like Senegal, for example, that I hadn't really noticed before. So, yeah, thank you for letting me show you that.
Thank you.
Other questions for Marsin?
Regarding the Iraqi religious elite, the authorities, to what degree were they emphasizing peace and against violence in throughout those years?
From 1910 or
no, the time you've been talking about. Was that part? They're trying to maintain their authority by siding with, at times under certain issues, with certain political leaders, but were they more, would they lean towards making it more peaceful, pacifism, less violence? I mean, we're talking about a part of the world that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very fine line in every single one of these instances, and you can see that it would be harder for their followers to accept, them being less supportive against the British, for example. But there's some common themes that emerge. Like the one that's most prevalent is they're very much dedicated to the preservation of public property. So they'll immediately say that if you attack or loot public property, you're doing something that's wrong, no matter what the circumstances. So they've always consistently tried to do that, but I think it's definitely case by case. And it's touch and go for them. I mean, for the most part, I don't really associate them with any. They've never pushed people towards violence. They're much more reactionary than they are proactive in this way. But I would say the hardest test for them would have been the British, who are clearly a colonizing power, even more so than the Americans. For the Americans, they were a lot more quiet and willing to basically willing to work within the system to ensure that Iraq could have a quick transition. So their main goal with the Americans was get out as soon as possible and let's build a state rather than actually mounting an opposition, even though at the time there was an armed opposition, but they didn't condone or criticize it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you, this is probably a bit far-reaching, but would you say they were up till now successful in protecting the institution and maybe also securing it for the future in a way? Because you also talked about diminishing popular support. Yeah, just what your judgment is.
Yeah, I think they've been remarkably successful. If you see after 2003, which is the time in which the government becomes Shia dominant, so they face a lot less pressure from the government they're able to expand more. But at the same time, I think the big challenge for them was protecting their reputation and their public legitimacy. So it's been a learning curve for them because I don't think they've ever encountered the challenge of being thought of as the corrupt elite. That's never happened to them in their history, and now that's the new challenge for them. But I find them to be remarkably fast in their response, despite the fact that they're really led by people who are, who, when you look at them, you think these people just, don't really leave their homes or schools and are just dedicated to their studies, but there's something strategic going on there, and can't quite put my finger on, who exactly is the strategic actor there, but altogether, I'm not worried about its continuation or its preservation. I think they've been successful, and I think that the most difficult times were definitely behind them. I don't think there's a time more difficult than during the Ba'ath era or during 2003 when everything could have gone up in flames.
I know you said you might talk a little bit more about this one-on-one with our colleague here, but I find the collaboration between like the liberal and secular students that you were, or young people that you were describing with religious leaders really fascinating, because it's pretty different from how we usually see, well, here in the United States, like liberal and secular being explicitly anti-religious, and like I'm a student at the theology department, so I'm trying to complexify that narrative myself. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the factors that contribute to that willingness to collaborate, if that's even the right word.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the big puzzles for me when I was in Iraq. I just couldn't reconcile the growing. They don't use the word secular, they'll use the word madani, which means civil, but it just essentially is a way to say secular without offending people's sensibilities, because secularism is associated with atheism in the Middle East. So reconciling their madani or secular tendencies with the fact that they are willing to work with the clerics, and I've talked to them on both sides. One of them seems to be a purely strategic reason. They think that clerics are powerful actors. They have a lot of institutions. They also have somewhat of a connection to the government, and so having an alliance with them is the best way to see reform rather than revolution. So the more pragmatic amongst the civil society activists will pick that route. From the cleric side, it's a lot more understandable. Like, they want to. Iraq is a very young country. I would say average age was 21. So you can imagine they're really trying to get the youth on their side. And the funny thing about the religious establishment is, because it takes so long to become an elite cleric, there's like a 2 or 3 generational gap between like the leader of the religious community and the average person that they're talking to. So I think they're just trying to bridge that gap. But it's literally one of the puzzles that I've been trying to work on, and the answers I put out are mildly satisfying to me, but I still think there's something more.
One comment. Maybe it's useful to make a distinction between what you refer to as the Hawza, or the legitimate Shiite establishment on one side, and a number of clerics who are in politics, somewhat independently and sometimes, going their own way. Sadr, for example, and the role that he has played is entirely different from the position that you described for the formal religious establishment. And it seems to me that that distinction is really critical. That is, not all clerics belong to that religious establishment, or their activities are not in line with or observant of the teachings of the edicts of that religious establishment.
No, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's exactly where my theory comes in.
Yeah.
So if someone like Sadr, I characterize him as someone who has a very low sense of institutional responsibility.
Absolutely.
Because they have exited the system, essentially. So they don't care if Najaf goes up in flames
and resorts to violence and encourages his followers.
Yeah, but he has authority because he's able to say, I originally come from this institution. Right. And so.
But it's important to make that distinction.
Oh, I do in the book, absolutely, yeah. I'm so happy you mentioned it, because it's really understanding the difference between a firebrand cleric, who we always hear about, the ones who promote violence and the ones who are unstabilizing, and then the ones who basically call for, like this guy who says, if protests happen, we don't immediately support protests. We work in silence and try to figure out what's happening. And really, the essential distinction between these two is whether they have this sense of institutional responsibility, and that comes from whether they're in the system and where they are in it. So someone like Muqtada Sadr, who his grasp for authority is basically referring to his father and his father-in-law, who both were really important clerics, so they have a lot of authority, and he derives his authority from being related to them, but he himself isn't part of this institution in any strong sense. I mean, he has to be part of it in the sense that all clerics have to be trained in it, but he has no loyalty to it, and that really makes him someone who can use power. I mean, the cliche is, with great power comes great responsibility, and he has the great power but very little responsibility, as opposed to exactly. So yeah, thank you for raising that distinction. I've gone off to different sides now. So.
And maybe, if I may draw a comparison, there's a fundamental difference between the religious establishment that you're describing and the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. The Catholic Church is hierarchical, and the Pope has responsibility for every level of that. And under normal circumstances, every Catholic priest would owe allegiance to and would follow the fundamental basic teachings of the Church. But there is no parallel between that and the religious establishment that you're describing. They don't have that authority to dictate what Musa Sadr should or should not do. Mm-hmm. And even if they do, it's not going to be heard. It's not going to be followed. Mm-hmm.
No, I draw out the distinction between the Hawza and the Catholic Church more, and it's essential because you're getting at to something that I was trying to describe earlier, which is that the space isn't very, it's not very institutionalized. There is a hierarchy, but the hierarchy doesn't map onto something that you can outline on a piece of paper.
And they could disagree among themselves.
And there's multiple. It's a very decentralized hierarchy in a way, so that contributes to the feeling that if you behave irresponsibly, this institution will fall apart. Whereas I don't think the Pope thinks that the Catholic Church is in any danger if he himself does anything. It's not going to spell the collapse of the Catholic Church or bring about instability for it. So you're asking all the questions that I'm happy that I was hoping someone would raise, so thank you.
One more question.
Well, maybe a question building on that. I'm just curious why you think that the Western rhetoric is always reinforcing this idea that it's like the Pope. What do you think is going on there? Is that just misunderstanding religion or making assumptions about religion, controlling people in these ways, or?
Yeah. I don't think it's an unfair thing to say. I can see why. It's because there's someone who's at, the head of a religious establishment, and a lot of people who believe in this faith return to this person and seek their advice. So the Grand Ayatollah in Iraq, Sistani, for example, is the spiritual head of a large number of people, and at the same time has a lot of students and agents, and has this organization of his own. So I think it's a useful way to explain something to people who have probably never encountered this institution and have no reason to encounter it. So I'm sympathetic to wanting to do that. I understand where it comes from. But I also, the key distinction is that even the hierarchy doesn't work in the same way. The challengers that can arise organically in Najaf. And when it's time for succession, when Grand Ayatollah Sistani passes away, there'll be a different kind of, it'll be much more shrouded in mystery than when a pope gets selected.
Please join me in thanking Marsin for an excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.